Good evening, everyone, and thank you for all these kind words. My wife and I have been once before in Georgia in 2016 and found a fascinating geography and excellent food and very hospitable people. So we really did look forward to come back again. A brief background, why was this book created? Essentially because when I was a young man of 18, working with school projects, I ended up in Lima in Peru, from middle-class Norway. And what surprised me in Lima was that all the people I met seemed to be just as efficient as the ones in Norway. The people handling luggage at the airport, the drivers, the barbers, the people in the hotel. But everyone was so poor. So when I came back to Norway, I decided to look it up in a dictionary or an encyclopedia to find a question, to find an answer. And I didn't find an answer. Then I started studying economics. It was a BA in Switzerland, and was fortunate enough to be taught by people who had got their education before World War II, and therefore also had some different ideas. Then I started an industrial company, which I worked with for 20 years. I took an MBA from Harvard, and I should say that my ideas are not very leftish, because they're essentially the ideas that what you're taught at Harvard Business School. Well, why is it that Bill Gates makes more money than a shoe shine boy? This is the logic of the book. It comes straight out of Harvard Business School, really. And then I discovered that was also a logic that countries had before. So I think this book was originally published in 2007, and it's by now into 23, 24 different languages. But it's in a way much more interesting now than it was last time I was here in 2016, because now we see a world order crumbling. We had the Americans saying, free trade solves all the problem, everybody should have free trade, and then you get an election where Trump on the right and Sanders on the left agree that free trade is not good for the United States, right? And this is a similar thing that happened in 1848, that David Ricardo's theory then died for the first time, attacked by Marx from the left and the great liberal John Stuart Mill from the right. So in a sense, this is a kind of collapse which we've seen before. I think the basic problem is that you remember the communist utopia was that from everyone according to their ability and to everyone according to their needs, and then the West created a kind of a counter utopia based on an old theory that nobody had paid much attention to. This is the key thing. David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. And the problem of the theory is that it's based on the barter of qualitatively identical labor hours. So one labor hour with Bill Gates is like one labor hour of a shoe shine boy. Right? And that kind of theory is always in the interest of the high-tech people. Right? It's not in the interest the country of shoe shine boys. This is a bad theory for the country of shoe shiners, but it's a good theory for people who are the countries that are technologically advanced. And interestingly enough, there is no capital. David Ricardo's theory was based on the labor theory of value, just like Marx. I would say a lot of the bad stuff in Marx he got from Ricardo. And obviously, you need capital. But the strange thing is that the capitalist theory of international trade doesn't have any capital. It's based on labor alone, and that alone is kind of a contradiction which should make you think. So this is the theory that is now collapsing and causes the global confusion. Trump, Brexit, the EU peripheries. The EU has a problem in the southern periphery. Greece, Portugal, even Spain and Italy. It has problems in the eastern periphery. And I think it's in the interest of Georgia also to adjust its opinion on international trade in sync with the rest of the world. I come from a country which is in the periphery. We in Norway are in the periphery of Europe, and we're not a member of the EU. 3 countries that were invited to join which said no: Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. What do they have in common? They never had any feudalism. So I think a kind of explanation is that they saw Brussels as a kind of a feudal lord. When I say this in Brussels, people get very upset. But it's a strange confusion. It's a strange coincidence that the only ones who didn't join were the ones who had never had feudalism. I think that is interesting. And I must say, I voted twice in Norway in favor of joining the EU. I now understand that I was wrong. that the people who said no were actually right. So opinions shift. So the new understanding is here. I quote World Bank chief economist Justin Ufilin. Except for a few oil exporting countries, no countries have ever gotten rich without industrialization first. Absolutely none. So when I did my studies and did my PhD after at Cornell and after the MBA at Harvard, and I said, well, economic theory cannot have been like this forever. So I took the oldest book I could find in the Cornell economics books in the Cornell University Library, written by an Italian by the name of Antonio Serra in 1613. And I thought, from my point of view as a businessman, that made sense, because he distinguished between increasing returns industries and diminishing returns industries, and I'll get to that later. But my thesis was based on this very, very old theory, and I tried to prove that it was right, and it was, because exactly what Serra said in 16 about poverty in raw materials. I found it in bananas in Ecuador, I found it in cotton in Peru, I found it in tin in Bolivia. So I actually went out and checked. So May last year, I found myself in Nur Sultan at a round table in the presidential palace. And with me was the chairman of the board of Nokia, the chairman of the board of Boston Consulting Group, and 3 former chief economists of the World Bank. And I found that 2 of them, Mr. Justin Ufilin and Paul Romer, who got the Nobel Prize in 2018, we all agreed. Right? So there is a change here. It's like the world is flat, and then very few people change their mind. But then everyone who thinks the world is flat, they die, and a new generation comes who knows that the world is round. So I think we are in a similar, we are in a situation like that important people like World Bank chief economists see this. So, and the interesting thing here, if you go back and use n-grams, n-grams is very useful. Google has produced a tool that you can take any term of any word and check the frequency in books. They Google all the books in the world, and you can check the frequency. And the interesting thing here is that David Ricardo's theory is from 1817. But you see that this is from 1817 on. And you see that the most popular economists in the 18th century in English was John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill said that all countries need infant industry protection. So he is essentially saying what we again starting to understand. And David Ricardo, you see him here at the bottom, was not very popular. And if we go to the term comparative advantage, which was invented in 1817, but when does it become popular? It becomes popular at the beginning of the Cold War with Paul Samuelson, who writes an article, oh, if we just have free trade, we'll get factor price equalization. So this was really part of the Cold War propaganda from the West. And I think the most scaring thing here is to see that in English, the term comparative advantage, which won the Cold War, when the Cold War has been won, economists stop using it. Right? So it seems that economists are very, they react to demand. If there is a demand that proves that capitalism is perfect, economists will produce it. Right? So in a sense, I don't know if many of you have studied marketing, but in marketing there is supply push, and economists were actually they were mathematizing economics and making it very abstract. And then there was a demand pull. You know, the West needed an ideology, so it was the perfect match of the new fashion in economics and the ideology that the West needed. Which is, I think that's kind of scary. That economists are like mercenaries. And here is the invisible hand. Right? The invisible hand, you know, it was strange things, mesmerism and strange ideas in the 18th century, and then it kind of dies out. But then you see here, just like after 1950, the invisible hand is back in fashion. And I think this is telling, and thanks to Google for that. So the theoretical illusion that became the ideological foundation of neoliberalism in 1949, under the standard assumption of neoclassical economics, will have factor price equalization, Ricardo and Samuelson. In 1997, this has become mainstream. So the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization actually says we should unleash the borderless economy's potential to equalize relations among countries and regions. They actually believe that if you put shoe-shine boys in one country and Microsoft in another, they will become equally rich. Right? So that they have started, in the beginning it was just like a theoretical curiosity. But then in 97 it actually becomes a belief. So I think we should listen to the Americans. Right? But the problem is which American to listen to. Here are two banknotes. A $2 bill and a $10 bill. I don't know how many of you have seen a $2 bill. Could you raise your hand if you've seen a $2 bill? Okay. Oh, that's impressive because they're not very frequent. But Thomas Jefferson was the man who said that the one who governs the least governs the best. Right? He got the $2 bill. Right? Alexander Hamilton, who wrote a report, I have all my students read it every year, a report on the manufacturers of the United States, delivered to the Senate in 1891, I think it was. And he says, he gives a list of 7, 8, 9 reasons why the United States needs to industrialize. Right? And he won. And the interesting thing here is also that, well, the young man Hamilton was killed in a duel by Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Burr, right? And I would have loved if they argued about industrial policy. They didn't. They argued about the women. So, but anyway, you know, it's dramatic that Hamilton is killed, and that shows you that when they decided who should go on the bills, there are only 2 on US dollar bills who have not been presidents, and that's Benjamin Franklin, who wrote a book also on economics, on Poor Richard, 1,200 editions. It was a small thing, but it's one of the most popular books ever. And Hamilton is also a bestseller. So the Americans actually, they're very pragmatic. So what they chose, well, we use the Jeffersonian rhetoric, and then we'll use Hamilton for practical policy. So in Chicago, you have the University of Chicago saying, the government shouldn't do anything, and then at the same time, the mayor of Chicago establishes an incubation center for high tech. In Washington, the World Bank says you shouldn't do anything. Well, a few blocks away, they're following Hamilton, and there is this U.S. Small Business Administration who does exactly what Hamilton said you shouldn't do, or Jefferson said you shouldn't do, right? So this, I think it's very important to understand this rhetoric reality gap. And I'm in contact with Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican senator, who's trying to produce actually an industrial policy for the U.S. Trump is chaotic, but there's someone in the Republican Party who's trying to make an industrial policy, and they wrote to me that this idea of Hamilton and Jefferson, they loved it, and they saw that actually what's been happening, and now the U.S. needs Hamilton again. So this is very messy, but it's just to show you how different economic activities are. So this is 51 industries in the United States between 1899 and 1937. So we get a perspective on it. The automotive industry is to the left, and you see it had the increase in production was 200,000%. The increase in employees was 20,000%, and the productivity, the number of man hours per car went down by some 80-some%. Right. So efficiency increased tremendously, while the output increased also tremendously. And there's something called Verdon's law, which you see the relationship between the increase in number of wage earners and productivity and wage earners go together. So the industries is quite logical. The industries where there's a lot of increase in demand is also the industries where there's a lot of increase in productivity, right? And on the right-hand side, you have the losers, with linen goods and hats and gloves and locomotives and railroad cars. No productivity increase at all. And we had a nation-based world economy. And in the nation-based world economy, every country of any size had all of these. Right? The good activities and the bad activities. So even Yugoslavia had their cars. Every Western European country had their car produced, even Yugoslavia. But what happens in the global economy is that the rich countries take over all these goodies, all the winners. And all the technological dead ends end up with the poor. That's the risk of being poor. You're specialized in being poor in a sense. And this is most clearly seen in Mexico, that Mexico has, in fact, statistics for wages, which they separate the low-tech stuff near the border with the United States called maquilas, and the old-fashioned industry. And you see that the old-fashioned industry with high wages is dying, and the low-wage industry is coming up. So when NAFTA took place, everything that could be mechanized was taken to the U.S. And everything that could not be mechanized was taken to Mexico, even in agriculture. So, wheat and even maize, corn, which originated in Mexico, that was taken over by the U.S., and the Mexicans were left with, picking strawberries and and picking citrus fruits. Right? So all the good stuff that with the potential of technological change went to the rich, and all the technological dead ends go to the poor. I think this is an important difference between the global economy and the nation-based economy. So raw materials has a triple curse. Diminishing returns, sooner or later more marginal land or less rich ores have to be employed. You start with the best land, and as you are more and more successful, you move into marginal land. So the more you specialize, the more the risk is to go into diminishing returns. The OECD had a report on Chile last year, and they proved that every ton of copper that Chile mines, the next ton of copper is more expensive to get out. So that's why it's dangerous. If you're a diversified economy, well, then it's not a big problem because other industries will take over. But if you're a single commodity producer, you may be in trouble because you may fall into this diminishing returns. Perfect competition, commodity competition. Perfect competition is the ideal in economics, that there is no price control, and in that case there's no. The producer cannot control the prices, and in that case, when you have technological change, that will be reflected immediately in the lowered prices. But in manufacturing industry, it's different because they have market power. So one day in March 1915, Henry Ford doubled the wages of his workers from $2.50 a day to $5 a day, and everybody said, "Why do you do that? Why do you double the wages?" And his PR answer was, "Well, I make so many cars, so to me it's necessary that normal people like my workers can't afford to buy a car." Behind it was also that he had problems attracting workers to this very mechanical, very repetitive work. But you have, in a sense, you have two kinds of capitalists. Those who think like Henry Ford, that it's good, actually, that high wages is a good thing. And you have the other capitalists, or the financial capitalists, who would see wages go down. So it's also a change in mentality here among capitalists. And there is cyclical production. Often the total harvest can be worth more when production is at the lowest than when it's at the highest. In the 1930s they were running the locomotives with coffee beans. It smelled good, but it was a way to get the production of coffee out of the way. And one basic, if you have some really intuitive questions here, you can ask to the neoclassical economists. Why do the most efficient farmers in the world, in the US and in the EU, still need subsidies and tariff protections? If you're the world's most efficient, and you still need subsidies, right? Like the German farmers. That should carry you in the direction that, well, if that's the case, of course, the rest of the world cannot get rich on agriculture, if even the most important need subsidies. Right? So, and here is interesting where the Chinese really hit Trump in the wallet. When they imposed, one of the early things they did in this trade war was to impose a tariff on soybeans from the United States. Soybeans cost the United States subsidies already cost them, I don't know, $20 billion. That was a huge amount. And by hitting the soybean export from the US, that doubled the price of the subsidies that the United States had to pay. Had to pay for the soybean farmers to survive, right? So the Chinese understand this, and they really hit a weak point. So this is, just to give you an example, this is from my thesis. I was sitting in Ecuador, sweating in Guayaquil, and looking at bananas. And in the 60s and early 70s, there was a disease on bananas in Central America. So Ecuador suddenly had kind of a monopoly. And you see, production went up, but the average yield per hectare is like a mirror image of the area cultivated. It's really because there's only one province in Ecuador, Provincia del Oro, which is really suited for bananas. But when they went out of that, it became, the average yield went down. And this is what happens to all non-industrial countries. Right? And when they started this, they got poorer with bananas, they said, well, we'll start subsidizing soybeans and something else. Then you see when these lines cross, to the right there, the crossing point to the right is slightly higher, and in a sense that's technological change, which is dwarfed by the diminishing returns. So this is how it looks in practice. And if we put what's happening now into a perspective, we see that the hegemons of the world will always be interested in free trade. But when they lose their hegemony to another country, then they change their mind. So Holland was the first industrialized country in Europe. In 1720 there was a financial crisis and Holland never recovered, and they stopped free trade. England is even clearer after 1910. The strange death of liberal England, 1910 to 1914, that's when they started protecting again. They had been the great free traders and they started protecting. And now this is exactly what's happening with the United States. So there is a logic in this apparent chaos. I'm trying to find some logic. And here is an alternative story of the Cold War. We know that the Cold War was of two systems that were entirely opposite, right? They were only different. But if we start looking into it, they had one important thing in common. The communists and Western capitalism had one important thing in common, and that was the cult of industry. The great theorist of industrialization was German economist Friedrich List. He had two big ideas: manufacturing and infrastructure. And I think he was about the only hero that East and West Germany had in common, right? And you see that when they celebrate him, to the left is a stamp from the German Democratic Republic, from the communists, and to the right there is a stamp from German Bundesrepublik Deutschland, West Germany. And they even picked the same portrait of the guy, right? I think this is amazing. This is amazing. And I don't know how many other heroes did you have in common with East and West? Not many, right? So there's a local hero also here. I don't know if I get it right. the Georgian. This gentleman, who was born in Tbilisi, Sergei Witte, and he was minister under the last two Tsars. And he wrote a secret memorandum to the Tsar in 1909, and he said, well, I really think our policy is wrong. We should forget about all those empty territories in Siberia and industrialize around Moscow. Right? And when the Bolsheviks took over, most people were fired. The only people who kept their job were the ones working in Witte's Department of Industrialization. And that grew. Right? So his idea was lists, diversify out of raw materials into industry, maximize the division of labor and infrastructure. He actually built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, Mr. Witte. Right? So he was a big follower. So when people were saying, like in 1930, well, what is it that these Bolsheviks are doing? Well, they're just following the policy of Mr. Witte, you know. And that is something that got lost. I think that common cult of manufacturing industry. The space race in the 1960s was, of course, just a continuation of that, right? They were competing in being the best industrial country. And Stalin was steel and electrification. Right? So here is where the right and left were on the same side, and they were actually right. And this thinking was there until the integration of Spain into the EU in the 1980s. Spain was integrated over a 10-year period. Tariffs went down 10% per year. They did a lot of investment in Spanish industry to make sure that the EU was an integration between equal industrial powers. Right? And this is an important lesson, that free trade is always beneficial as long as it's symmetrical. So people at the same level of development. So the origins of this, I won't spend too much time on it, but is a book from 1589, Giovanni Botero, The Greatness of Cities. Why is it that cities are great? And he starts this, he's completely forgotten now, but he was actually the dominating economist from 1589 to the 1670s. And if you look at English economists or English philosophers, Francis Bacon, there was a thesis in Cambridge last year on the roots of Francis Bacon's thought, and it was Botero. It was out of Italy. And here is a statue of him in kind of halfway between Milan and Genoa, if you can imagine. And this guy said, like I mentioned, a brief treatise on the causes that may make kingdoms abound with gold and silver where there are no mines. And this is how economics was born. Why does all the gold and silver that Spain takes from the Americas, why does it deindustrialize Spain, and why does this all end up in Venice and Amsterdam? That was the beginning of economics in a sense, and it goes well with the rest of the theory. And some of this was actually still there with the Cecchini report, which was the report that prepared the European Union for the single market in 1988. Cecchini calculates that about 80% of the benefits of uniting, making a single market in the EU, is due to increasing returns. 80%. Because the market is bigger, companies will produce cheaper. You know, it's absolutely logical. Completely in line with Botero and Liszt and all these people. But if somebody had asked Mr. Cecchini, what if manufacturing industry dies out in some of the member countries? What if manufacturing dies out in Greece and Portugal? Should they still join the EU? He would have said no. Right? With his logic, if you didn't have manufacturing industry, you should not join the EU. And we have to think that, we have to remember that agriculture was so complicated that it took a long time before agriculture went into the EU, and for a long time, 80% of the EU budget was actually subsidizing agriculture. So, the Cold War has led to some interesting developments. And here is from a former World Bank economist, Branko Milanovic. Don't look at the data from Armenia. I don't think he had the data from Armenia. So I'm not suggesting that Armenia is doing well, okay? I think if I look at what country lost most manufacturing industry at one point, and Armenia won that game. So forget about Armenia, but there is something here. Income below 1989 levels. These are the countries that were actually richer under communism than under capitalism. Why? Well, because it's better to have an inefficient manufacturing industry than not to have any at all. Right? And the shock therapy killed it too fast. So here is Ukraine, Montenegro, Serbia, Tajikistan, Georgia, and Hungary to some extent. You see, Georgia, the majority of the population, according to this Branko Milanovic, were actually richer under communism, wealthier under communism. Right? And the sad thing, in a way, from a political point of view, is that a country like Belarus they are actually doing very well. So, and you see, well, Azerbaijan stands out being very different. Well, they use their oil money to give to the poor, right? So that's why actually it's so different. It's just a distribution of oil money. It's not because they did some industrial policy. So the problem here is that democracies have to listen to the World Bank and the IMF, and dictatorships don't. Right? So these are the wages in Belarus and the Ukraine. Ukraine started, they were roughly at the same level. Don't look at the ups and downs. The ups and downs is just because it's in dollars, right? So what's going up and down is the dollar. Look at the difference between the wages in Belarus and the Ukraine. And my explanation of that, and I got is that it's not because Lenin is there with his hand up at the main square in Minsk. It's not because of Lenin. It's because they have an industrial policy. And why do they have an industrial policy? Because they are a dictatorship and don't have to listen to the IMF and the World Bank. So, I mean, the West has built in a tremendous incentive against democracies. Right? Our son is a 10-year professor at Harvard Business School. And he's fed up with students from Singapore and China telling him, ha, you and your stupid democracies, see how poorly you're doing, right? So, I mean, neoclassical economic theory, David Ricardo's trade theory, and the institutions supporting it are, in my view, a threat to democracy. Right? And I met economists in Minsk who had a PhD from London, and he said, I really don't like this regime, but I like what they're doing to the economy. Right? And this is something that I think the West should, and the same thing with Africa. Right? We are with our institutions, we are underdeveloping countries unnecessarily. So there is a link here between economic structure and population carrying capacity. Hunting and gathering societies, Amazon. If there are more than 2 people per square kilometer, that's too many, because there's not that much to hunt and to gather. Then you get into a more advanced state, you get into agriculture, and you have 40 persons per square kilometer. And then you have an industrial society like Holland, where you get up to 400. So I was working in North Africa, in Eritrea, and I noticed that when the population of Eritrea reached 40 persons per square kilometer, there were clearly too many. And people, where did they go? Well, they went to Holland, where there were 400. Right? So 40 persons per square kilometer is too much in Eritrea, and 400 is no problem in Holland. That has to do with economic structure. Right? And this is something we have also unlearned. Geography is also something we have unlearned with this very abstract economic theory. So the only nations with a large manufacturing sector, rather a large sector with, it's not really manufacturing, it's these increasing returns. That's the key. It can happen in services also, but normally it's manufacturing, are able to feed a large population. So deindustrialization necessarily leads to depopulation. Extreme cases. Moldova. I've been there. Invited by the Fiji, and southern Mexico. Children grow up with their grandparents because both parents work abroad, and it's cheaper to keep the children with the grandparents at home than to take them to the US or wherever they're working. Not talking about that they wouldn't be let in. that's a different thing. I mean, there are two very good reasons that they stay behind with the grandchildren, with the grandparents. But that's kind of sad, right? So I think countries should take depopulation seriously. Latvia lost 20% of its population, and they feel it kind of like a shame, So I think it should require consideration. And I think we have to rediscover the old logic of the Marshall Plan, which was the one which died out, I said, which followed up until Spain. The President of the United States sent out an ex-president. This understood in the late 40s that something was wrong in Germany. Because to punish Germany, the Western societies prohibited industry in Germany. That was the worst punishment they could think of. Right? And Hoover, who had been in Germany during the First World War, was sent out, and he wrote back in 18th of March 1947, "There is the illusion that the new Germany left after the annexations can be reduced to a pastoral state without industry. It cannot be done unless we exterminate or move 25 million people out of it." The word exterminate in 1947 was a very strong word. Right? And what had happened was that the Russian sector had not prohibited manufacturing. So people were moving from the French, the British, and the American sector into the Russian sector. So it looked like Russia was winning. Right? And to prevent Russia from winning, we had, they had the Marshall Plan. And this is my last slide. It's a result from that. George Marshall was the first 5-star general in the U.S. Army, right? And he became foreign minister. And during the war, he was in charge of logistics. Think of logistics for the U.S. military during World War II. This was a man who had, as the Germans would say, Übersicht. He had an overview of things. And the speech he made at Harvard when he launched the Marshall Plan, he says, "There is a phase of this matter which is both interesting and serious. The farmer has always produced the foodstuffs to exchange with the city dweller for the other necessities of life. This division of labor is the basis of modern civilization. At present time, it is threatened with breakdown." Right? So say, okay, we have to reindustrialize Germany, but while we're doing that, we also have to reindustrialize every country from Norway to Portugal to Turkey and around to Taiwan and Japan. So this idea of the link between manufacturing and the city and the countryside was actually what started this fantastic boom from the late 1940s until the mid 1970s or to 1980. Right? The idea that every country should have this, or every economic unit, let's say. It's strange to say that here, when in a sense, this is the cradle of modern civilization. And I think, with my experience from the Andes, when I look at Georgia, I think what Georgia has is a very short distances from one ecological niche to another. And this produces that diversity, the same kind of diversity that Venice had, right? It's a very brief travel from the cotton niche to the potato niche, right? And this theory actually is the theory which now explains why the Andes, where the Andes could hold 12 million people when Columbus came, while in the US there were only 2 million people. And the whole prairie was one ecological niche. But the numerous ecological niches in the Andes could actually hold 12 million people. Population density of the Andes was, inhospitable Andes was 60 times the population density of the US in 1492. Right? So when I take that Andean theory and look at why Georgia was so early, I find the similarity. And the answer is somewhere in geography. And it's back to the old argument here of diversity. You had nature here produced diversity, just like industrial policy in Venice produced diversity. So that's a big strength you have, and obviously, tourism. I think this is a wonderful place for tourism. But tourism, unfortunately, it does create employment, but it doesn't create high wages. So we can talk later. I have a couple of suggestions for concrete suggestions here, but we'll leave that perhaps for later for the question and answer section. Thank you.
პირველ რიგში დიდი მადლობა ცხადია მაიამ ყველაფრისთვის, რასაც ამ თქვათ აღწერაში მოვისმინეთ. თქვენ ბრძანეთ, რომ გაქვთ გარკვეული მოსაზრებები საქართველოსთან მიმართებაში, ბოლოს ასე დამთავრდა თქვენი შემოხსენება და არ ვიცი რამდენად კონკრეტულია, რამდენად შეიძლება კონკრეტული მიმართულებებზე საუბარი, მაგრამ ცხადია მთავარი არის მაინც იმის გარკვევა, თუ როგორ უნდა აღმოვაჩინოთ ის ინდუსტრიები, რომელიც შეიძლება იყოს საქართველოს პოტენციალი. ანუ ამ შემთხვევაში არა კონკრეტული მითითება, თქვა სფეროსი შეიძლება ესეც გითხრათ, მაგრამ თავისთავად პროცესი, რომლითაც შეიძლება ჩვენ თავად მივიდეთ იმ ინდუსტრიებამდე, რომელმაც შეიძლება გამოიწვიოს ქვეყნის განვითარება.
Okay, thank you. That was a perfect short question.
Yeah, and it was a perfect first question. The minimum efficient size of nations has grown. In the 1930s, Estonia with 1 million people could have all industries. I come from Norway with the same population size as Georgia, so I understand the problem. I think the key idea is to add value to raw materials, right? And then the question is, what raw materials do you have? I understand from last time I was here that you have high quality clay, right? And if you have high quality clay, you can make tiles. Producing tiles, technology can be bought off the shelf in Italy, and you can actually add a lot of value. You also need heat, you also need high heat. You also have hydroelectric power. So the heat needed for the tiles, you also have the heat. So I would say, if we can go into details. Finland has perhaps the best strategy for how to subsidize industries for the first 2 or 3 years. We can go into that. I would recommend the Finnish strategy for getting into high tech. And the other thing is, I would take, this is what I say in all countries, well, look at your import bill. What is it that you're importing? And see, where is it that with a minimum of intervention, you can actually produce it yourself? And here I'm sorry to use Russia as an example here, but one of the few successful things Russia has done is to produce its own chickens. They used to import chicken from the US. They called them bush legs at the time. Just as you now import from China. I think you should, in some way, whether by some hygienic thing or a tariff, build your own poultry industry. And poultry is, in a way, a bad industry because these animals are fed a lot of antibiotics to grow fast. And that antibiotic goes into the body of the consumer. So my suggestion is use the high quality image of Georgian food and make ethically correct and healthy chicken, which may cost a little bit more, but maybe you can even export them in the end. It's not very complicated to produce. Buy some expertise, and it can also be spread geographically. So it's not something that can only be done in Tbilisi. It can work as a regional policy as well. So these are, two examples.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about the countries, the new trends in economics. I wonder if there is possibility for sustainable, for example, eco-friendly countries with circular economy to become wealthy, and if you have any example of it. Thank you.
Yes, I think this is a pertinent and important question. I think one of the things which happens, one of the slogans here is food that has not traveled long, right? So if you want green, well, produce local things, and that's why I think my chicken strategy fits very well with the green. And there are all modes of production coming back. I mean, before capitalism, people were dealing with reciprocity. I think this is an important point. Now, if I got married, you would come and help building my house, and I gave the food. So when you later married, I would come and build your house, and you would have the food, right? This was how the world was organized before capitalism. And, well, how is Wikipedia organized? They happen to be organized in the same way, right? So I think this new technology also opens up for a possibility to go back to ancient modes of production, right? So I think the green will call for less long distance traveling especially for food, and I think perhaps local cooperatives can start again. In Romania there's an interesting example of local cooperatives defending themselves against big multinational food chains, right? Food companies. So I think there's definitely some things there, but I think what you will not have is degrowth, because what we measure is purely coincidental. We measure things that are on the market, but technically Wikipedia, since they don't pay wages to hardly anybody, Wikipedia doesn't contribute to GDP, or if you so we have to look at this again, at this whole notion of GDP, and find that what we measure is actually by chance. What we measure is it's just when it's on the market, and I think some things will be taken out of the market again, and three-dimensional 3D printing. I think there's a potential in 3D printing to decentralize a lot of products. Maybe a lot of products can come back to the village level. Maybe shoes can come back to the village level from the big factories. I think there are lots of opportunities out there. We just have to think in a different way, and we have to put the local entrepreneurs and the local initiative people, and not the financial capital, at the core.